Hello, everyone. This is your host, alexbalgood, and this is Leap of Health. And today I'm so pleased to connect with Robert Espew. He's connecting with us from the other side of the world, which I love. I love to connect with people all over the world and connect and talk about health stuff. So thank you, Robert, for being here today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you, thank you. And we're going to be talking about meditation that induce samadhi. Is that how you say it?
Samadhi states, yeah.
Nice, nice. But before we go into that, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became this coach for already over 23 years now.
Say that last part again. How I became what?
Mental health coach for over 23
okay.
years, right? Yeah.
Sure. I started. So I became a Buddhist monk, a monastic, back in the early, in the beginning of the 90s, right, 1991. And so that time, I also was mainly practicing in America. In America, it's a little different. You have to generate some money to support some things. You want to go to India or kind of offset some of your travel. So monks don't make much, you know. So I became a psychiatric nurse. I spent 6 years as a psych nurse. Then I went into addictions for a while. I worked pretty much almost everything you can do in mental health, prisons, mental hospitals. I ran outpatient program, inpatient program, drug and alcohol, gambling addiction, sex addiction. So working a long time with addictions, and that I really started to see a lot about trauma and how much the cognitive behavioral therapy and 12-step stuff we were doing, not that I'm against that stuff, but for trauma, it really doesn't work. And it wasn't doing anything. People were cycling in and out of centers all the time. I read a book by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk called The Body Keeps the Score that really shifted how I saw things. And I became a therapist. So I started working with somatic psychology dominantly. A lot of what I do has been informed by the fact that I've also been a meditation teacher for 35 years. I think it's important to understand that I've traveled a lot of countries and I've spent a lot of time living abroad in monasteries. And I've studied mostly classical forms of meditation. So dominantly, that means that I've been trained in classical forms in the Orthodox Christian tradition, like Hezekiah. These are the type of meditation practices you learn in Mount Athos, which is the oldest Christian monasteries in the world, in Greece, right? Also Hamudra in Tibetan Vajrayana, Mochao in Chinese Chan Buddhism, which is the same as Shiken Taza and Zen. A lot of training in Pratyahara from the Hindu tradition, in working with various types of Sufi practices, and also a lot of Kabbalistic practices from some rabbis that I trained with. So because I grew up and my mom was a radio psychic and a charlatan, it kind of left me with a lot of skepticism about people that were new agey. And also, yeah, I kind of grew up in Los Angeles and Hollywood. I worked in the recording industry before I became homeless and went into becoming a monk. And it kind of left me with a lot of a very skeptical attitude, right, in the beginning. So I've always kind of moved towards studying more classical forms. The big difference between studying classical forms of meditation and normal forms of meditation, it's quite big. One of the things you learn as a monk is the differences. You're taught pretty intensely how to discern between psychotic states and genuine spiritual experiences. This is a huge part of traditional Zen and a huge part of traditional Shamatha Vipassana Buddhist style training, which is quite different than meditation in America. So I think it's important to understand. I want to talk a little bit about Samadhi, which means roughly concentration. It's odd that Americans, meditation teaching started really in the late 60s in America, with different groups, Sivananda, Maharishi, Mahesh Yogi. And they've been around, since the time of Yogananda, really, early, and other yogis, who came into America. Suzuki and Taizen Mizumi Roshi, these types of people. But most Americans are learning about meditation through really the lens of either Vajrayana Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, some forms and practices, or they're learning it through Zen or some Hindu teachings, and they kind of filter down. But even after many years of research on meditation in America, and even after a lot of teaching, most people really strangely don't understand Samadhi. And in fact, it's just really started to be studied by people like Daniel Goleman, Dr. Daniel Goleman from Harvard, who pioneered, the idea of emotional intelligence. So Samadhi states really are really the core reason for meditation. This is taught in all Eastern teachings. And it's important to kind of understand something very important, which is that the way that Euro-Americans view meditation is really affected by postmodernist subjectivism. Whereas in Asia, throughout Asia, like for an American to talk about meditation, it can mean anything. Knitting is meditation, bathing is meditation, playing guitar, playing basketball. They'll say anything is meditation, but they're really confusing it with concentration. And whereas in the East, in any country, Cambodia, Vietnam, Thailand, China, Japan, if you talk about meditation, everybody agrees. Everybody knows you're talking about the stillness and the silence of the mind. There is no argument about this across the board. Everyone knows this is what this means. It's not subjective at all. There's different methods, there's different ways, but everybody knows you're talking about activating the consciousness. It's a really big difference. And it also affects the way that Americans and Europeans are learning about meditation through that subjective lens, and how they're altering it in such a way that's actually not really useful, because Samadhi states are really blissful, beautiful states of serenity. And it's odd that even in the sutras of the Buddha, so many people claim to be studying Buddhism, but in reality, 32 sutras teach Samadhi states. The Buddha teaches these 8 levels of Samadhi. There are higher states of consciousness. You can virtually find nobody in the US that teaches this. Certainly no one in any yoga center. It's very rare. There's a handful of people in the US. I'm one of them that teaches how to enter Samadhi states. Now here in Thailand, of course, it's widely known. There's a lot of forest monasteries devoted to teaching Samadhi states and what are called jhana, the 8 levels of Samadhi. When you can go into states like this, it deeply alters the way you perceive things, down to the fact that some meditation masters can even sit. I had a teacher that could sit in meditation 24/7, no bathroom, no sleeping, no food, no water for 7 days straight.
Wow.
7 days. We were with this guy. No bathroom, no lying down, no water, no food, 7 days, because of being in states of Samadhi. Daniel Goleman, the Harvard psychologist, studied several of these people and saw that they live in brain states that they didn't think it was possible, which is gamma state of brainwave all the time. So Samadhi states are really unusual, and they create an ability to access information that's not normally accessible to a normal person through thinking. And this is a really important thing to fundamentally understand the difference between liberation psychology and Western psychology, because a lot of people think that they're the same, and they're not. They're totally different paradigms. And where it really splits off in this way is that it really comes down to this one fundamental thing, which is, what is consciousness, right? Because in the West, we believe that consciousness is equivalent to thinking or feeling or neurotransmitters or the brain or the body somehow, right? Whereas in the East, everybody knows consciousness is not thinking, and it's not feeling, and it's not your brain. In fact, in Japanese, the word for mind refers to the heart. And they see the brain as being like the engine, but the heart is the driver. And actually, a lot of Asians see it this way, right? So it's a very different paradigm. So consciousness, and what consciousness is, of course, it's been a very controversial subject for thousands of years. And even in modern times, there's a big argument around this. People want to all the time try to equivalate consciousness as the brain, but look at a jellyfish that has no brain. Tell me that thing isn't conscious, right? So there are lots of things that are conscious that don't, have a physical brain or brainstem the way we think of it, right? So having lived with Indians in the jungle who believe that, the trees and the plants and the animals are all conscious, including the plants, and that it's cruel to believe that plants are not conscious. This is why we feel so disconnected from the earth and from nature. I think this is a very important thing to consider. Now, when someone can learn to go into states of meditation where they can really deeply concentrate the mind, they can enter into these states called samadhi. Samadhi means both concentration, but it also means putting together. So putting together, in a sense, your silence, your concentration with your consciousness. They're one. Your concentration, your consciousness are one. And when you go into these states, there are 8 states that the Buddha teaches, and he learned these actually from 2 Brahmins in his day. And the first one is called bliss. The second one is joy. The third one is contentment. The fourth one is called equanimity. The fifth one is called the sphere of infinite space. The sixth one is called the sphere of infinite consciousness. The seventh one is the sphere of nothingness. And the last one is called, are you ready? The sphere of neither perception nor non-perception.
Okay.
Yes. And when you can enter these states, it creates a kind of a laser-like focus of your consciousness and deeply separates your consciousness from your thoughts and your feelings. The way I would say it to a Westerner is that it puts you into the precognitive state that you experienced as a baby before you learned language, before you lost that look in your eyes, right? That open look where your heart is really open to the world. It puts you in that same inner state, and you begin to understand things about connection and oneness. And through that, you can begin to perceive life in a very different way. So I think this is a really important thing because a lot of the way that we're understanding about meditation in the West is really limited. Without samadhi, we're not really understanding the consciousness, because the purpose of meditation is to reflect us back into what our true nature is, which is serenity, love, right? And to feel what Atman is, right? The source, how we're all connected as one. Believing that is one thing, experience is another. Now, there's some really strange things that are possible in samadhi that it makes it possible to verify and have direct experience of some very controversial things when you go into samadhi. You can learn to do a mantra and use mantra for concentration, for example, if you're practicing Hindu methods, right? Like Om Mani Padme Hum or Gate Gate Paragate or Hare Krishna or something like this, right? Or there's lots of mantras. But if you go into samadhi states, the mantra is a key that opens up a door into a specific experience of consciousness. So you experience what's behind the mantra, which is really interesting. If you can go into a samadhi state, it's pretty easy actually to experience a previous life or several previous lives. You don't have to believe in anything. It's totally irrelevant if you're atheist, Christian, Jew, it doesn't matter. In the silence of the mind, you can access a different type of memory that's contained in consciousness, not a memory that's in your brain.
Right.
Samadhi gives people the ability to access, I would say, the intelligence of consciousness, which is different than the way we see intelligence now, which is everything is intelligent based on mental evaluations and dualistic comparison. And that's how Westerners tend to see intelligence, through memorization, through intellectual comparison, through dualistic understanding. And so there's a real limit to that, actually. And yeah, is that making sense? Is this a little bit too much?
No, it's very interesting to really put those two things parallel and see them that they're so different, yet we've been thinking it was the same all this time. Especially, I've said it many times in my podcast, because people are like, what's your meditation practice, or what do you do? I have a hard time like being still. My mind runs like hardcore all the time, having all these ideas and always creating and all these things, right? And I have the misconception that, as you mentioned earlier, that I think especially here in the West, in America, we think that everything could be meditation, right? But it's, as you say, it's more as concentration. I always say that I'm a dancer, so when I dance, there's a point when I'm dancing that literally there's nothing else in my mind, right? It's like there's almost this emptiness, but as you said, it might not really be meditation. It's more like concentration, but we're confusing those two. And I've always said it. Yeah, my meditation time is when I dance, because I think of nothing, but I'm in the moment of this connection with another person. But you're right. It's yet I am in the moment, and I'm like, perhaps experience some of what you mentioned of the bliss and being happy and stuff. It might really not totally be that meditation that you're talking about. So it's interesting that we have mistaken this type of concentration. I guess in the West, we don't experience that much concentration because we're busy all the time, 24/7, whether it's like on the internet or with life. Life happens so fast in here that these little pieces, these little times of us concentrating, we have mistaken them for meditation, but it's literally now we're concentrating in one thing. And so that was an aha moment as you're speaking. I'm like, wait a minute, you're kind of right.
It's funny you bring this up, because I remember before I became a monastic, I was a drug addict, and especially I was using a lot of methamphetamine. And I went from using methamphetamine as a homeless guy into being a Zen monk, right? And I hated meditation. I hated it. And the Zen master used to say to me, you don't have to like this. You just need to do this or you're going to die. And that helped me quite a bit. And I remember at that time, this was when the DSM-3, I'm kind of old, I guess. This is when the DSM-3, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Health, there was no ADD diagnosis. And when the ADD diagnosis came out, we just thought that was hilarious. All the monks just laughed. We thought it was so funny because we thought there was a joke. It became around monastery, which was, monasteries exist. Everybody has ADD. That's why we have monasteries. Everybody has ADD. That's why everybody suffers. We thought it was clearly a reason for pharmaceutical companies to make more money, because not a single monk I knew wasn't struggling with ADD. We wouldn't have called it that, but that's exactly what all of us are struggling with, right? Is the sense of self, the sense of identity in desire, right? In the mind, and feeling ourselves in our mind. And it's really funny that we have, come to believe that it's impossible to quiet down the mind. It's a strange illusion, I think, because all of us can do it eventually, And all of us have if you have the ability to see that, you obviously have your consciousness active as well, right?
Yeah. So I know you talk about the 8 steps to do this type of practice.
Yes.
How do we do that? Like, if you will, like, if I'm ready right now and I'm like, Robert,
Yes.
I need to do this. How am I gonna go from concentrating? Because now I could tell you, like, I could concentrate. If I dance, I could concentrate in one thing, but now I want to not do that and really experience what
Mhm.
real meditation is. How would you walk me through those 8 steps? How
Sure.
people can start doing this? Because I feel like
Mm.
a lot of people might be thinking like, I kind of just like to do this moving meditation, or the way we call it. It's not even meditation, as we're finding out with what you're telling us. So how you take someone that it's almost ready, and now we're like, okay, what do I do now that I know I can concentrate in this world of fast, fast, fast that I've been living in?
Mhm. Sure. Maybe I can show you a little PowerPoint. Is that all right?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. So I would say the first thing that's important to understand, so I'm going to kind of explain this from a more Buddhist perspective.
Yeah.
That you can find Samadhi teachings in every ancient religion, right? All the dominant ones. But for me, I think the Buddhist version of it is it's a little bit easier, maybe more clear to understand this. So let me pull this up for you to show you here. All right. Can I get permission to share the screen? That'd be all right.
Yes, let's see here. uh da-da-da. Oh, let me see, how do I do this?
Keep
Okay,
it.
got it. Got
Okay.
it.
Beautiful. Okay. So can you see my screen?
I can now, yes.
Great. Okay. So let me move up a little bit. So this is a class I teach both in English and Vietnamese. So this is kind of the traditional language of yoga. You learn this in both Hinduism and Buddhism, right? So it's a
Mm-hmm.
sort of a traditional Sanskrit language. In Raj Yoga, where you find the meditation teachings, you'll learn these things: yama, niyama, asana, posture, pranayama, um, pratyahara, dharana, and dhyāna. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to explain a little bit about this, right? So now, normally when we learn meditation, so I'm going to pause this here for a second.
Mm-hmm.
We learn meditation. Most people are just learning concentration practice. Now, Shakyamuni Buddha actually differentiates in the Eightfold Path between what he calls right mindfulness and right concentration. This is another big mistake that Westerners are making. They're equivalating mindfulness and meditation when they're not the same. And in fact, there is no such thing as mindfulness meditation in traditional forms. That's a total American construct. It's based on the teachings of Bakin and a body scan method. But in reality, they're actually separate practices, because mindfulness really is a form of self-observation that you do during the day. So the first trick that I would teach someone, because I teach people to do jhana in the community, the first thing I
Mm-hmm.
would do is give them some exercises that they would need to do every day to start activating their consciousness and to separate their conscious awareness from their thoughts all through the day, right? And this involves learning how to observe ourselves in a new way than we do now. So, in other words, mindfulness, I'm going to define as an objective, non critical form of self observation. It's not being in the moment, because you can be a heroin addict and you're lighting up your spoon in the bathroom and you're really in the moment, baby. You know what I mean? Really in the moment. But it's not mindfulness you follow. That's just really hypervigilantly aware, right? It's a negative mindfulness, I suppose, but it's a sensation based mindfulness, like eating the raisin. Now, most Americans are teaching sensation based mindfulness because they don't know how to activate their consciousness in a way. So, if you're gambling and you're at a craps table, you're also thinking you're really mindful, you're really in the moment, and everybody's betting on you, and it's a high, right? But that
Right.
also isn't really mindfulness, even though you're really in the moment, right? Being in the moment is a side effect of mindfulness, it's not the definition. Mindfulness happens when you begin to observe your attention with your attention. Like right now in this moment, if you say your name to yourself, Alex, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you kind of ask yourself, who am I? And you try saying, who am I? You'll notice that just for a second, you'll have a little curiosity that emerges, and you'll start to look backward at I. And you start to look backward at that I, and you want to stay in that action of looking backward at that I over and over and over. And you want to fall in love with that action of looking for that I. You want to fall in love with the action of that consciousness, looking for your attention and where your attention is actually coming from, moment by moment. Now, the habit of the brain is to always want to think and evaluate, where is my attention coming from? Is it this? Is it this? Well, I read in a book. I better look it up on Google. But if you just keep looking with your awareness, using your awareness to look for where your awareness comes from, you start to have a different experience. In fact, you'll notice that thought will sort of start to slow down or even stop a little bit. And an interesting state starts emerging, okay? So the Zen master Dogen Zenji says, to know yourself is to forget yourself, right? So to look back and to be aware, this is the beginning of mindfulness. Mindfulness is really the act of observing your attention with your attention, of exploring your awareness, right? So, and I would also say this, there's levels. It isn't a static thing. There's actually levels of mindfulness. As you practice more and more, you realize there's different levels of it and different levels of comprehension. There's different kinds of mindfulness that happen as you keep practicing. So as you practice mindfulness, you also realize something else. It's synonymous with concentration. There is no mindfulness without concentration. To look back and observe your attention right now with us, with me and Alex, if you're listening and doing it, you notice it takes a little bit of concentration. You're kind of dividing your attention by being aware of my voice and Alex and yourself. So it takes a little bit of concentration to do this. And you got to get used to it. You got to get used to observing your attention and being aware of your outer event. When you start to observe your attention, you practice Taoism, which is to find your center. Right? So you become aware of the outer state and the inner event, but you don't feel identified with either one of those. You're observing both, right? So this inner separation starts to happen when you observe your attention without stopping. And it's that practice through the day that you keep trying to hold as you're shopping, as you're going to the bathroom, as you're talking to people, as you're with your kids. That is a beautiful thing. Yeah, and I try to teach people a certain method by which they try to fall in love with their consciousness, and work in a way that opens the heart. Because to go into samadhi is also to realize how defended we live and how closed the heart is. Because when you start to go into samadhi states, your heart really opens up, and you start to comprehend. It starts to helps you to release. I'll try to explain this. A lot of the psychological pain that's holding us back, right? You start to see it. The heart opens more and more and more. So the second thing happens when you learn to go into mindfulness is you have to start to learn to recognize a state called access concentration. Most people, when they're meditating, in whatever system you're using, you'll always have this experience at some point of access concentration. Access concentration happens when you're sitting there and your mind just starts to get really quiet. All of a sudden, you're doing the mantra and you feel like you and the mantra are one. You feel like the mantra is doing you. You feel like you and the breath are one. You feel like everything kind of quiets down and you feel really focused and you feel really easy and it feels really quiet. And sometimes the next day you try to go back and do the same thing. You burn the same incense, you wear the same clothes, you do the same practice, and you just can't get back there. And you're like, why is this happening? Why can't I get back to that space? And you try it for weeks and you start to feel a little discouraged. Why can't I get back there? I would say it's just simply we don't understand the signpost of access concentration. In Sanskrit, this is called upachara samadhi. So upachara samadhi is this place of access concentration, right? Now, access concentration is like this transitional state that most yogis, practitioners will go into. If they don't know how to recognize it, they don't know how to turn it into samadhi. into the blissful stage or the joy stage, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes people accidentally fall into one of the 8 jhanas. That happens to people. You can fall into it when you're sick. You can fall into it when you're just in a really good place in your life. Sometimes people accidentally fall into it. We often wonder, how did I get there? How do I get back there? Right? Some people go into it accidentally in a psychedelic state. Samadhi states are naturally occurring states that happen when the mind gets silent, right? So even the Buddha, when he learned them and he went into the first jhana, he remembered that as a child, he'd experienced this before, right? So learning to go to access concentration, which is recognizing when your mind starts to quiet down. It's not perfectly quiet, but you feel an inner separation from your thoughts. And I'll tell you, the first stage is you feel an inner separation from your thoughts. You feel like you and your breath are one. And there's still thoughts there, but the thoughts feel kind of like they're a radio playing in the background. You know, you hear it, but you don't feel identified with it.
Mm-hmm.
At that stage, to start to transition into samadhi state, you would find a pleasant sensation in your body. And you would begin to focus on that pleasant sensation as the object of your concentration. So instead of a mantra, you'd let go of your mantra or the anaprana, the breath, and you would say, like, find a tingling that's on the side of your lip. And you'd feel that tingling over and over and over. And that would kind of create a positive feedback loop. And that would start to amplify the tingling. If you don't have any expectation, you're just sitting, feeling the tingling, and suddenly the tingling starts spreading throughout the body. If you have access concentration, and it'll start amplifying, 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 and you'll start to feeling a huge bliss that will feel almost orgasmic.
Mm-hmm.
So the more quiet the mind is, the stronger the bliss is going to feel. And then there's a transition into the jhanas are different levels of letting go of the mind. The first 4 jhanas happen based on using qualities related to the body and sensation. They're emotional states, I would say, not sensation really. But the last 4 jhanas you enter by focusing on qualities of consciousness itself, which is where you really begin to see how consciousness is not thinking, because there actually are qualities to it. And you enter into these states by focusing on those qualities, which makes sense when you're in it. So the first stage, I would say, how do you get into it? You get into it by doing a practice every day. I also recommend doing pranayama. When I teach students, I have them doing a certain type of Bhastrika pranayama that we do every day. I would say to really learn jhana, you have to either do it on retreat or you have to have a teacher you meet with every week. And you're reviewing your meditation practice every week. I ask students to write down their observations every single day because it requires a pretty good amount of concentration. To go into jhana, you got to be able to sit at least a minimum of 30 to 40 minutes a day.
Wow.
To touch it.
Mm-hmm.
So now I want just to encourage everybody by saying my mom, who was a school teacher for 30 years, when she first started learning meditation, she did 20 minutes a day and she was like, this is really hard. I don't think I can do this. My mind is agitated. It's crazy. I don't know.
Right.
But she's like, well, I read some books that this is really good for me and I want to do it. But my mom in 6 months started going into jhana. And in 8 months, she was meditating for 2.5 hours a day. And she felt it wasn't enough. She wanted to sit longer. Because after you start going into jhana, you lose the sense of time. And you can sit 2 or 3 hours really easily. It doesn't feel like anything.
Mm-hmm.
Because you are outside of the sense of time, which you experience through your thinking and your mind.
Right.
So I think anybody can learn this. If I learned it and I was a dude who'd been addicted to drugs and hated meditation and definitely had ADD or ADHD, even if it was just drug induced, I definitely feel it's possible for anyone. And I've taught a lot of people to do this and people that didn't think they could do it. So I would say samadhi states, but they do require that people are pretty dedicated to meditation practice and that they really want to do it every day. And that they can learn how to practice mindfulness every day. And they really want to do that as well.
So why will someone would like to do this? why will someone will take, that time, the 1-2 hours, when they're like, you know what, I have a very busy life. I have
Yes.
kids. I have all these other things that I'm doing right now. Why will
Yes.
I sit for, 40 minutes, an hour, sometimes 2 hours, as you're mentioning? What is that doing to myself? Why should I be doing this?
Well, my teacher had 3 kids, and he used to meditate 4 to 5 hours a day. He
Mhm.
would just sit. He would get up really early before the kids at 3 in the morning and sit till about 7 a.m. And your body is resting exactly the same as it is sleeping in samadhi state. And he began to access, be able to access his consciousness in a different way. So he really felt the reward of doing this. When you can go into samadhi states, you can access some very unusual things. You can meditate on karma, or like whatever you can do in therapy or hypnosis, you can do 100 times better in samadhi, meditating on problems, but coming to the understanding of how you resolve those problems through the consciousness, accessing what people call God or the being or Atman or whatever you want to call it, Allah, reality,
Mhm.
and also accessing something in physics that's called the unified field, right? Accessing that. In Buddhism, they call it shunyata, or the illuminating void. You
Mhm.
can access these types of experiences that are normally not open to a human being, right? These types of profound experiences to understand beyond any kind of beliefs what that we really come from love. And one thing that I learned in samadhi that motivated me to meditate with a kid, even though I have every day, is that once you experience that type of love that comes from within you, you never really look again outside of you for love. You never become dependent on a human being for love. I don't mean that you don't love people, or I love my wife and I love my son, but you don't you realize that love isn't something outside of you. It's
Mhm.
not something that you feel resentful toward your partner because they don't give you enough hugs, or give you enough sex, or give you enough money, or in some way say enough nice things. It doesn't come from that. It's
Mhm.
something that comes from within us.
Yeah.
And that part really shifted something for me. And I think that that's something inside of all of us.
Mhm.
So my hope is that I would love everybody to have the access to that, because I know it's inside of you as well as me, right?
Yeah.
And I think everybody wants that experience again of realizing how we're all connected. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I do think that's like super an important point, because I think that's when people falls into drug addiction,
Mm,
overeating,
so true.
busyness, life. Just we fall into all these things, and also being dependable of others to access that love that we can't within, because we don't have maybe the tools to practice, or we some people have never even tried to
Mhm.
yoga or meditation or anything like that. So I think this is a great tool, because once we can access love and we know that love is within us, there will be a lot of problems resolved.
Yeah, I think it's a really beautiful thing if you're able to practice at home. In fact, there was a really beautiful saint. I think her name was Deepa Ma. And what was beautiful about, let me look her up real quick, because I think that's her name. Deepa Ma lived in the city. Yeah, yeah, yeah. She was a Theravada Buddhist master who lived um, in the US. She influenced some of the Vipassana movement. And the thing about her was that she taught people you don't need to live in a monastery to learn how to go into samadhi states.
Mhm.
You can access it within you in your normal life, right? With children, with job, but you do have to feel determined that happiness isn't something that comes from outside of you.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's an important thing, is that happiness is really subjective, right? It's depending on sensations, you liking me, my wife hugging me, me having enough money, things going my way. You know what I mean? Serenity is an inner state that we generate inside that isn't dependent upon things outside of us.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it was helpful for me that I was homeless, and really that level of depression, having nothing, my family abandoning me, and me feeling really, because I'd been through 6 divorces. My mom and my dad both remarried 3 times. They both kicked me out of the house. They were really troubled people who had really a lot of trauma themselves,
Mm-hmm.
and it put me into a deep depression. They were definitely depressed. And so, for me, learning how to be a monastic really taught me I really had to look within, because, you know, everything that I was doing was making a hell for me,
Right.
as an addict, right?
Mm-hmm.
I was looking for happiness and sensation for sure, right?
Yes. And I think
Yeah.
that's what these, almost like this modern world
Hmm.
um almost teaches us or send us to get that happiness from.
Yes.
And I think once we can access this love within, and we're not waiting for anything or any situation or any sensation, I think a lot of
Yes.
our troubles will definitely go away, and we'll see life in such a different lens. And that's what we ultimate, as you said, that's what we all want. We're all strive in life to be happy and feel loved and being seen and all that. And I feel like we go through life trying to look for all these things and all these people and situations, when we
Hmm.
have the tools within, when we could, um, you know, learning and accessing those things within us, we really don't need anything else. Everything else like a bonus.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. It'd be my hope for people to really feel this, because yeah, it's amazing to know that we really truly come from love, and that when
Mhm.
your mind gets still and silent, I would challenge anybody listening, if you have the ability to go on a free 7-day meditation retreat, like a Goenka retreat or a Zen Buddhist retreat. A lot of Zen monasteries will still sponsor you and allow you to go on a 3-day or 7 retreat, sometimes 7-day retreat. If you can do that, um, you certainly can see, after sitting for 3 to 7 days, that your mind will quiet down enough that you'll be able to see something inside of you beyond your thoughts, something beautiful that's at the
Mhm.
core of you. That's
Yeah.
a really beautiful experience, to see your true nature.
Mhm. Yeah. And I feel like once you see that within, you can live life so much better. And
Yes.
with a lot of less expectations that we put upon ourselves, you know.
Yes. And I want to emphasize one more thing I think is important too, is now for me, I teach for free. And
Mm-hmm.
I believe that it is unethical to not teach meditation mindfulness for free. The Buddha, the Dharma was made free to everyone. And most therapists, mindfulness teachers who write books and teach teachings and incorporate Western psychology charge money. And that is not how they learned it. And it's not how none of my students teach it. And I do feel it's very important that the truth not be connected to the money, because all human beings have a right to this, all human beings.
Yeah.
And no real teaching is accessible for $200 or $1,000, like TM costs, for example.
Mm-hmm.
That's not accessible to somebody that's homeless. It's not accessible to somebody that's living in Brazil in the ghetto. That's not accessible to somebody over here in Thailand that is living in middle class.
Mm-hmm.
People, everybody has a right to the truth, and I think that's really important for teachers who are really trying to teach awakening of consciousness to understand that piece. If you really truly access this core, you can actually access the knowing how we're all connected and how we all need this. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I love that.
That part is really important because I see now Americans, I see a lot of podcasts being like, do you make six figures and you're teaching spirituality? Like, wow, that's interesting. Americans for so many years had this televangelist culture, right? You go on, all these Christians are making millions and millions of dollars with mega churches and TV churches. And now, well, we're stopping all of that, but now we're transitioning into millions of dollars with mindfulness and brain science and psychology. And wow, back in the late 90s, when I think was the big tsunami that hit Asia, the one that hit Sri Lanka, Pfizer, the drug company, thought it was going to be really generous, and it sent out all these therapists to Sri Lanka to set up tents to teach the people of Sri Lanka about what is trauma and to try to help them realize they had PTSD and give them medications and teach them about dialectical behavioral therapy, which teaches meditation, mindfulness. Now, the people of this is talk about, cultural ethnocentrism, right? And the absurdity of it. People of Sri Lanka have been practicing Buddhism for 2,000 years, and they're scratching their heads going, what? You're trying to teach us meditation and mindfulness? Is this a joke? Are you kidding us with it? But you also want us to take medications? Are you kidding us? Is this really for real? They couldn't believe it.
Yeah.
And wanting to charge a little bit, right? And they're stunned because your monks are walking around every day, teaching for free, begging for food every morning, right? So I think this is a interesting contrast, right? So having taught in a lot of poverty situations, it's really hard, I think, for Westerners to see this, how mixing spirituality and money historically, when we look at the problems with religion, historically, this has never been a really good thing. The Catholic Church has had lots of problems with it. Christianity has lots of problems. You know what I mean? Everybody's had a lot of problems with that. And I think people got to be careful when they start teaching awakening, concentration, samadhi, these things, charging money for that. And because I certainly didn't pay anything to learn this. And I show my gratitude to my teachers through that, right? This belongs to every human being, not to me.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it just depends, on people, what they're going through and how they learn it and what their goal is. I think a lot of all the greatest teachers out there, they just wanted to change the world. And, I mean, on my point of view, I think we all do things like that. We all do free. And by all means, if some people wants to make money out of it, that's also their journey and how they decide to, live and go about life. I do believe that wealth in general, it's available for everybody. And I don't see I'm not, in a fight with money and doing what I love, if I will say
Me
that.
neither. That's why I'm a therapist, right? Making money is fine.
Yeah.
Truly, I agree with you. Anybody can make money. Teaching people how to awaken, it's not necessary to teach money to do that.
Right.
It's all of our human rights.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Just like water. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Water is something we show. Don't you think so? Don't you think we all have a right to water?
I do.
Yeah. We all have a right to consciousness. We all have it, right?
It's funny. I've always thought that since I was little, why we should we pay for water? That was like always my thought. And I do. And later I have one of my really good friends. She's from Armenian. And I don't know if you know this, but in Armenia, water is free. There's actually water fountains around the whole city for people to drink.
That's amazing. Yeah.
Isn't it that cool? Like
Beautiful.
nobody really has to buy water or anything like that. There's literally water for everyone. It's as accessible, it's clean. You could drink it. You could be anywhere, and there's all these things. In Armenia. So I thought, I was like, oh my God, that's great. What are we not doing that all over the world? But
I know it's a little controversial. I know it's a little controversial, this idea, this topic of this, but you know, I know that on your podcast you are allowing for a lot of different ideas. So I thought I'd be able to kind of express that, you know.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do think that you know, what you were mentioning about the money, I feel like we have the responsibility, and especially once you have those tools within you, to share them.
Yeah. I have to say too, you know, I have a bias. I mean, I definitely have a bias because as a therapist, I dominantly work with religious trauma. So, you know, through working with a lot of religious trauma, different types of religions, I definitely see how money, you know, in the long run tends to affect people's perception of power, of relationship, you know, and you know, there's a lot of fear. People shore up, you know, that we want to survive, and there's different survival strategies we take on, right, to survive. And so, yeah. So, I mean, I definitely have that bias of trying to help people, you know, who are deeply, deeply afraid and have been deeply harmed by religious. So,
Yeah,
you know,
no, and I think
teachings,
it's great what you're doing. And as you say, you're learning from free. You're paying it off to the community as doing the same. So I think that's also great. And as I mentioned, everybody's journeys and the way they take their life and how they acquire wealth, it's slightly different. And I feel like it also comes from how our upbringings, our fears, what we think about money, how we have seen money for a long time. And obviously we do have different journeys everywhere, right? And with each individual. I would like to talk a little bit more about consciousness, which I thought it was great. You mentioned consciousness is not the mind, it's not the brain. And I think that's just amazing for everybody listening. You guys have heard me saying it before. I interviewed Mark. His name is Mark Gober. He wrote a book. I don't know if you heard of him before. I don't know if you are familiar with him.
No.
Okay, his name is Mark Gober, and he was a very accepting person about consciousness and what it is, and if it's tied to the mind and all that. So he went on his journey and wrote a book. And scientifically, he proves how the mind is not connected with the brain. So I thought that was just amazing of how you're saying it, because I feel like a lot of people have that misconception of, you know, my mind, my brain, that's where my mind is, and that's where my consciousness is. And I think understanding that is not, it plays a big role going and understanding meditation and getting to that stage that we were talking about to induce that Samadhi stage.
Yes. There's a really interesting book called The Mind and the Brain by Dr. Jeffrey Schwartz. He's a UCLA research psychologist.
Yeah.
What's really impressive about this book is that he examines, I don't know, 20 years of hardcore scientific studies, like very materialistic studies around consciousness, right? So, you know, chapter after chapter gets into studies where they've like severed the nerves of monkeys and they can remove half of your brain, you can still function well. It goes into all these studies that have been done, right, on the effect of consciousness on emotion and sensation and the body. And Jeffrey Schwartz is considered in California anyway, from what I know. Lots of people make claims, but what I know, he's the first person to really successfully work with obsessive compulsive disorder using mindfulness and meditation.
Mm.
And one of the things that he brings up in his book, and I think he shows pretty elegantly, that it's really hard to pin down. Really, in reality, when you look really carefully at the scientific studies, you cannot say that the brain and consciousness are one. There's a little space in there between the time you want to drink a water and the time your body responds to, in your, I want to drink a water. You may be aware of the sensation, right? But what's aware of that? So he says, if we're just really a biological machine and everything is truly organic, like psychiatrists love to say, well, you have a chemical imbalance. Take this medication. You got a chemical imbalance. Okay, if you're really a biological machine and obsessive compulsive disorder is really just a brain problem, so you'd really truly believe if you step on a crack, you're going to break your mother's back, right? So how do you know it's a problem?
Right.
What part of you knows that this isn't okay? I've got to get some help. What observes that? What steps back from the compulsion? If it's all just your biological machine driven by nature, you shouldn't be able to do that. Do you follow?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So this piece is so important. I think people don't often step back and what is it that knows, right?
Yeah.
What is it that's curious?
Mm-hmm. One of the examples that this guy mentions on his book, Mark Over, is that in one of the examples he gives about the difference of consciousness and the brain is that he goes and brings all these studies about people that has had these near-death experience type of thing, where they have died, meaning like your brain is dead. There's no action. There's no like electricity going back and forward anymore in the brain with the physical brain. Yet these people experience what the people outside the emergency room or whatever they were when they passed. In that second, what they were saying, what they were thinking, what the docs say, what the doctor, the nurses were acting to trying to bring the person back, even though they were dead. So I was like, that's a really good point, because when when your heart's gone and there's no more electricity going to your brain, now the brain is dead. How is it that the consciousness went and have access to all this other information and what was happening on the moment when people die? So they go into all these studies of like, how is it that the brain is dead, yet the people experience all these things that were happening around them? So I thought that was a really good example to kind of like understand that they are really not the same, that they're really not one thing. So
Absolutely.
I thought that's brilliant, showing that statistics and the whole study of a lot of people that have experienced near-death experience, or whatever they call it.
Alex, have you heard about this guy, Dr. Sam Parnia?
No.
Dr. Sam Parnia, just in the last year or two, did one of the most impressive scientific studies ever on this, because in the 70s, there was a Dr. Raymond Moody who compiled hundreds of cases of people that were clinically dead on the table. He compiled them into books called Life After Life, right? But Dr. Sam Parnia, just in the last, I think it was a year or 2 years ago, he did one of the first studies across Europe and America. I think it was at like 200 hospitals. It was a lot of people, where they studied an enormous amount of people who were died and clinically revived, and found a lot of evidence proving pretty unequivocally that consciousness continues to exist without the body, right?
Yeah.
It's a very controversial study, obviously, because a lot of people who are materialistic atheists, it's a kind of religion in itself, really. Some people really, truly don't want to see this as a scientific study, but it is really very interesting. You bring this up though once. There's one more thing I'd like to actually bring up about this, which is interesting, is that when I was in the Amazon, I had a chance to live for a month in the real deep Amazon with a group of Indians and near Yuriaco in Colombia. And one day I was out in the jungle with this woman, Kunti, and she was teaching me about the indigenous medicine. And she was showing me all these different plants and what they do. Like, she was saying like this, if you get real sick and you're nauseous, you boil this bark and this does this. If you get fever, you use this plant. And she's walking through and showing me different plants. I was really astounded the knowledge that she had about all of this. And I was like, how do you guys know all of this? And she looked at me very intensely and she says, me and my wife, who was there too, she says, I know what you guys are thinking. She says, you're thinking we're a bunch of dumb Indians and 1,000 of us ate this and died, and another 1,000 of us ate this and died. She goes, that's not what happened. She goes, we go into the silence of the mind and we talk to the elemental spirit of the plant and it tells us what it can do. And she was really intense about it. She's like, I know what you Americans are thinking. You're thinking we're dumb Indians. It really hit me hard the way she said that. She's like, this is like, she was really speaking to the fact that we believe that all knowledge only comes through thinking. And she's saying, look, we live in a different paradigm than you, right? And to us, we can know things without needing to do like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, the ayahuasqueros tell you, there's 30 different forms of ayahuasca in Colombia, but not to a plant ethnobiologist is, only a few species. But how do these guys know this? Because they all sing a different song. And when you're working with the elemental, it sings a different song. And all the shamans know this, right?
Wow.
And there's a different understanding through consciousness. You know what I mean? There's a different knowing that happens through consciousness. And the Indians that I've come across in Colombia, several tribes, including the Kogi and the Mamas of northern Colombia and the Kofan, they all really know this in depth. They were talking to me like Buddhist teachers I met, meditation masters, and these people know the same kind of thing through the
Yeah.
silence of the mind, through trusting in the consciousness. So I think this is for me, that had a very profound effect on me, the understanding of it's a different way of knowing than always through sensation and instruments that are prosthesis of the five senses, and everything is through sensation-based learning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like if we can all understand that through the consciousness, we can see life in such a different way, a better way, a more, because we live in this life, we all, by judging, by labeling, by trying to put things in a box for us, for our mind, for our brain, mostly actually, for our brain to understand things. But in reality, we really don't have to do all that to live well, where we can access the consciousness. And I know for everybody listening out there, they're like, this sounds a little, woo-woo and weird a little bit about the consciousness, but it's true. Once you start to understanding that we can access information, like, you mentioned earlier, by going into this Samadhi stage, you can heal past traumas, you can see past lives and all those things, which also sounds a little weird for the brain, right? But for our consciousness, we all have experienced at some time in our lives where we have deja vus, or we feel like we've been here before, or that we know something and we don't know why, or that we know what the other person is about to say, or we're thinking about someone that is sick and it's in the other side of the country, or in a different country. So we have experienced all these things that yet we don't have an explanation of it. But it's our consciousness.
Yes,
Telling
I
us
know.
Things.
It's very interesting right now that a lot of Americans are very super focused on cultural appropriation and diversity, but I wrote a scientific paper. You can access it online, called "The True Origins of Psychology and the Effects of Euro-American Ethnocentrism," right? And the paper really examines how our whole view of consciousness in the West is very racist and ethnocentric. And a big part of that is that we're ultra focused on this view of it, everything being the brain. Now, I'm not trying to say that we throw out the whole paradigm or it's black and white. I'm just simply saying that I'm going to take one example here. So there's a lot of, I mean, I don't feel this way, but there's a lot of resentment actually in Asia, especially in India, toward Americans and Europeans for not giving credit to the East for the origins of psychology and many psychological systems, right? Because the Buddha taught consciousness and about the consciousness and subconsciousness 2,500 years ago, really clearly. I mean, it's not amorphous, it's ultra clear. The term Buddha itself means awakened consciousness, right? So most people will say in Oxford and any American university, they'll talk as if Buddha invented a system. When they talk about Buddhism, they speak as if he came up with stuff, like he was sitting around thinking about things. But nothing could be further from the truth. When you really understand that, you read the sutras, you know the story of the Buddha, he didn't do anything intellectually. He spent 6 years going into the silence of the mind. Everything came through the silence of the mind. All his learning, all his understanding, all his teaching came through the silence of the mind. He learned the 8 jhanas. He went into shamatha practice and came up with vipassana, which is insight into the nature of reality. He saw the nature of reality. Vipassana isn't a body scan method. It's a reference to a set of practices that allow you to access information through the consciousness. In fact, Vipassana is actually often mistranslated in English as insight. In reality, it should be translated as clear seeing, which really means the same as clairvoyance. Clairvoyance actually means clear seeing. Same thing. You're seeing beyond the third dimension. You're seeing hyperdimensionally. You're seeing reality. Yeah. And so all of these things he accessed, theories of physics, deep psychological understandings. He taught cognitive behavioral therapy 2,500 years ago. He taught dialectical behavioral therapy. He taught psychodynamic theory, transactional analysis, all of these psychological Western theories, right? 2,500 years ago, he was the first person to give women equal rights to men, taught them how to read and write. The Buddha did a lot of unusual things. He was very psychologically sophisticated. And all of this through the silence of the mind, not through sitting around stroking his chin, thinking about stuff, reading papers and mentally evaluating and comparing past research. None of that happened. And I think it's really hard for Westerners to grasp that you can know things like the Indians. They're not a bunch of stupid indigenous people, right? And you can really know a lot without having to do it our way.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I think being a little bit open-minded about all these things, that a lot of what we're talking about, there is scientifically proved things for people that were so skeptic about it.
Yes.
And that they went on these hunt for answers, and they realized that there's a lot of scientific proof for all that we're talking about. Consciousness that is not the brain, that we could actually access this higher consciousness that is access to all of us, these higher knowing, or whatever you want to call it. We all have access to it. We just are so we have these taboo and all these upbringings that is foreign, it's not true, it's weird. But yet, as I mentioned earlier, we kind of all live it, and we're just not understanding that that's what it is. I mean, even those little examples that I give earlier, we always know when someone is in trouble, or we feel it. or we know random things about it. We have the vus. We feel that we've been here before, or all these things that they don't really have an actual mental explanation. But that doesn't mean that they're not true. So it's just, yeah, it's a whole thing. And I'm sure everybody that's listening are like perhaps thinking about it, or maybe like, no, that's weird, I don't understand it. But honestly, open a little your mind and perhaps read a book, some of the books that we mentioned. They're great to really dive into that, because it's just so important to know that we have access to this knowing that does not come from the actual thinking brain. So
Yeah.
I mean, we will see life in such a different way, especially, you mentioned you talk about a lot of, you work with a lot of people with religious trauma. And I think we all have been touched in some levels by that, because to me, most of the religions are based in fear, and that's how we live through life. Very in a box, very living in a bubble where nothing that it's outside of that fear is true. And I feel like if we open a little bit of minds and heart and this big consciousness that we're talking about, we will be so much free. We will live in so much bigger freedom and real freedom from everything, free from our hearts and free from our thinking brain. So yeah, I think it's very interesting to just keep on learning these things that they seem not true and almost magical in a sense, but they're pretty great, and they're pretty real, at least for a lot of people like you or me that understand a little bit more what really consciousness is. So yeah.
I mean, I think that, it's just, there's so much in what you're saying for me that really resonates. It's so true. Fear is something, unfortunately, that is in so many of us, right? We feel really frightened, and really scared, and I think really scared to connect, and also I think it's really hard for people to understand that consciousness is something that when we really experience it, it's something that's connecting, you know. Um, so a more liberation psychology way of looking at things, the ego or the false self construct is what really creates separation, you know. So in Western psychology, it's interesting that when you go to school, in graduate school, many schools will, not everybody really agrees on what the self is in psychology. It's a pretty controversial subject, just like consciousness. But a lot of schools will tend to introduce you in a psych program to this idea of object relations. So object relations psychology is basically this idea that a child creates its sense of self in relationship to nouns. Okay. So if we have a baby, the baby interacts with the environment, right? And with people, places, things. If it grows up in Pakistan, pretty good chance it's going to be Muslim. You know what I mean? Pretty good chance. And that it may grow up in a certain socioeconomic status. It's going to grow up, with certain views of reality, right? If it grows up in America, it's going to grow up with other different views of reality. Pretty good chance it's not going to be Muslim, right? But maybe non-religious in this time. So, every culture is going to have an influence, but it's going to interact with people, places, and things. And that environment is going to have a really strong influence on how it develops a sense of self. Now, in Eastern psychology, the idea of meditation and mindfulness, when you're doing it a lot, you're doing the opposite. You're actually sitting down, you're closing your eyes. Pratyahara, if there's probably a lot of yoga practitioners out there who learn Raj Yoga. So if you're practicing Pratyahara in Sanskrit literally means sense withdrawal. So you're sitting down, you're closing your eyes, you're withdrawing your senses, right? You're pulling the awareness, you're separating the consciousness from thoughts and sensation and feelings. And you're relating your awareness, your consciousness to nothing, to silence. And Samadhi starts to deconstruct the self. You're doing the opposite of object relations. Instead of creating a self and building up a self, you're deconstructing the self. You're starting to try to dissolve the ego, dissolve the self, right? And this begins to have, as there's less and less self and more consciousness, we feel more and more connected to the world around us, more and more connected to people, seeing ourselves in people and not separate from them, right? I don't feel more than you or less than you. I'm not measuring myself against you. You know what I mean? Trying to understand you. That makes
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah, I think putting all those labels that we grew up with down,
Yeah.
it's a big thing. And I think sometimes that's a bit scary for people to move through that, because that's what we know. That's how we live. That's how things make sense. But once we take all those labels down, then it's a bit scary, because now we're like, what?
Yeah.
How can that make sense? But yeah, I mean, it's a whole thing. I just invite people to, read, research, try things. I think, be curious about those unknown things that happen to you, and see them as an opportunity to see what else is beyond all these labels that we put around our lives and selves. And that's pretty much where we all start, right? Being a little bit curious about what else there is beyond what I know.
Yeah.
So I think that's a great beginning right there. But anyways, yeah, I mean, this has been an amazing conversation. I do thank you for all the information and everything that you shared today. For everybody that would like to try these meditation and the practices that you do, is there a place where people can reach out to you and tell you like, hey, I'm interested in this? Where can they find you?
Well, jhana meditation or samadhi meditation, you can research. There's some different teachers in the U.S. that do it. There's not a lot, but I would say couple really good books would be a book by Ajahn Brahm, who's an Australian Buddhist teacher, and there's another guy named um, he's a student of Ayakema. Sorry, his name's slipping my mind for a moment, but I teach in Asia right now. And so I'm not really teaching in America. But I do have some students that teach in America through the Gnostic teachings. And they're teaching through a group called the Gnostic Teachings. And there would be, I could give you their information actually right now, but I could give that to you to get in touch with them.
Yeah, that'd be great. I think,
And
yeah, go ahead.
oh, yeah. I mean, Lee Brasington, that's the author of the book. He teaches jhana, but this is a particular type of practice that you really do need to work with a teacher. You can read the books, you can try. Lee writes a really good book, but you definitely need to, have a good concentration practice. It's good, to have the support of a teacher or group when you're doing it. It really helps with this because it is a pretty profound practice. And you can really see the difference when you do this compared to just concentrating.
Yep.
So, because
Now
there's a
that we
lot of,
know the difference.
yeah, there's a lot of mystical things we've heard about meditation, but those things actually become really possible through jhana. So it's really worth investigating.
Awesome. Awesome. I will put all the information that you give me on the show notes for people to reach out to, some of your students or, other practitioners that do this here in the States if they want to really learn. I think that that'll be cool. Is there something that you would like to share with us before we leave?
Well, if it's okay to mention my religiostraumacounseling.com
Yeah.
website, I like to let
Yes.
people know about that because there's a lot of people who are really struggling, who grew up, I think having a lot of religious beliefs and are wanting to access something. And some people don't want to be atheists, but they also don't want to go back to what they grew up in. You know what I mean? They're looking for their own path. So I think that's the thing that Samadhi also offers you, is the way back to your own heart and your own path. So I do, I can incorporate some of that into the work I do, but I like to offer that to people because I know there's a lot of people really suffering with religious trauma, and it's a fairly new thing to be able to access that now, because if you haven't grown up in a closed religious community, normal therapists tend not to understand what it's like.
Mm-hmm.
So something I'd like to tell you before I go, sure, if it's okay. Maybe the last thing is I could tell you a little story we
Yes.
learn as monks that might be
Okay.
interesting. This story is a little bit about why it's important to learn how to concentrate and to learn how to access that consciousness separate from your thoughts. Why not to give up? Okay. So there's a master and his disciple, and they live in a little hut by the lake. And every day, as it is in Asia, when you kind of do practical, classical kind of Buddhism, you get up, you go out on the street, and you ring a little bell, and you do a little round where you're begging basically for food. Most people in Asia, they traditionally you give a cup of rice. You come up, you pour a cup of rice in the bowl. Some people give bananas or fruit or some other things or tofu, or some people give cash. Some people think it's ridiculous, think it's stupid, make fun of them. Just like the Jehovah Witnesses in America, they slam the door at the Mormon missionary. Get the hell out of here. You're an idiot. They make fun of them. Same thing, right? So after a couple of years of this, one day the disciple looks at the teacher and says, Master, I don't know if I can do this anymore. This has started to get really painful for me. Um, I don't know. When we go out every day and we beg, people start making fun of us sometimes. And when they make fun of you and me, it really hurts me. I mean, I've really tried to just practice, and I thought it would stop bothering me, but it hurts me more and more. And I don't know why none of this affects you. It doesn't seem to bother you at all, but it really bothers me. And I don't feel like I'm accessing what you're accessing. I just don't get it. I mean, I just don't think we're the same. I don't think I can do this anymore. And the teacher looks at him, the master says, no, son, there's no difference between you and I. Don't give up. We're the same. There's no difference. The only difference between you and me is the container. You just need to learn how to make your container bigger. He says, well, I don't know what that means. Okay. What do you mean making the container bigger? He goes, well, he says, okay, get the cup and the bag of salt and come down to the lake with me. So they just have one cup they share, and they have this little bag of salt to season stuff. So they take the bag of salt and the cup, they walk down to the lake together. And the master says to him, reach in the bag, take a handful of salt, put it in the cup, fill the cup with water, stir it up, take a drink, tell me how it tastes. So he does this. He says, yuck, that's horrible, right? It tastes bitter, Ugh, so much salt. Exactly. He says, now reach in the bag, take another handful of salt, throw it in the lake, stir it up, take a drink. So he does this, takes a drink, says, how does it taste? It tastes fresh. I don't taste the salt at all. He says, exactly. It's the same amount of salt, but the container is much bigger.
Mm.
So in this metaphor, the salt is the pain of life, right? The pain that each of us experiences. Right now, container feels very small. pain of life feels terrible, right? But when you practice every day and you practice every day and you keep going, your container starts to get bigger. And especially if you learn Samadhi state, your container gets bigger and the same salt doesn't have the same effect. Does it make sense?
That's beautiful. That was awesome.
Good, good. I'm glad you like that.
No, that was awesome. That's a good thing to end this conversation.
No worries.
Wow, that was great. That was great. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you for connecting with me. I know it took a while for us to get together, but I'm glad we definitely connected. I think this conversation has been amazing, and definitely I take a lot with me. And I hope everybody that's listening enjoyed this conversation. So I will put all your information on the show notes for sure.
Thank you so much, Alex. Thank you for having me too. And I really appreciate you doing this. Listening is a very special thing, and making a space for people just to listen to them and their truth. And I really appreciate you doing that, letting me talk. And it's very kind of you. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you. I'll definitely put all the information in the show notes. And remember, if you want to connect with me, you can find me on Facebook, Instagram, all social media. Also, remember, my book is out. You can find it on Amazon and Barnes and Nobles. It's called Parents Are Greatest Teachers. Thank you, everyone, for listening today. And please all do have an amazing day today. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, too. Bye-bye.
Thank you.